script to production to finally the big screen. You watched it with us tonight. What is that feeling for you to finally see this with an audience?
Well, this is my second audience I've gotten to see it with complete, and it's really rewarding. This was a very hard movie to make from conception on. It was 3 months of freezing our balls off in Canada. All that snow you see up there, not stage work, like we're out there freezing our balls off. And so it's really, really rewarding to be able to sit in an audience that gets it, especially, I got to watch it, Fantastic Fest and then here Beyond Fest, and two of my favorite crowds in the world. So that was pretty great.
Now, obviously, Black Phone, big success. At what point did you guys kind of start discussing, like, hey, obviously there's a financial end, it's like, you should do a sequel, but like, when you and Scott were really thinking about, like, what point is like, all right, we really want to continue this, and how did those ideas start coming together?
Well, the longer story of that is every day on the set of Black Phone, me and Scott would be sitting in the tent, and I would lean over and go, all right, hear me out. And every day he would take me seriously, forgetting that this was a bit. And he would go, what? And I said, Black Phone 2, bigger and blacker. I ran through every iteration of a bad title. The only one I hadn't come up with, someone came up with recently, was Black Phone 2 It's Grabbing Time. Which is one of my favorites so far. But so we never took it seriously because, it was based on a short story, it was very complete. And, you don't want to end up in a die-hard taken situation where how does the same kid end up in another basement? And I didn't want to write that movie. So it was very much one of those that we just kind of went on. And where we really started realizing we might have to take it seriously and consider it was after the film came out, because the film did well. But once it hit Peacock, it started showing up on TikTok, and all the teenagers had found it. And it was so many TikToks, and all of a sudden, overnight, all the kids went from having like 500 Instagram followers to having 1.5 million Instagram followers. And, all of a sudden, teen kids said, oh, horror is for us too? Oh, that's cool. And they started, loving on it and sharing memes and harassing us, asking us when the second one was coming. And we hadn't really truly entertained that. And then that conversation happened, and it was like, what about Black Phone 2? And I was like, I'm not going to make it until we have a good idea, a great idea. Because I got bullied into doing that a decade ago, and I wasn't happy with the result of Sinister 2. And I was not really thrilled with how that came out. I did not want to do that again. And so I said, if we get a great idea, I'll do it. And a week later, Joe Hill texts me, and he goes, I have a really stupid idea. And I said, I love stupid ideas, call me. And he called me up and he goes, all right, the phone rings, Finn answers, and it's the grabber calling him from hell. And I went, I could write that. And so I was like, you need to call Scott. And Scott's like, well, just send me an email. And so he wrote it out in an email. And Scott said, that's pretty good. And so we started spitballing it and then knocking around and figuring out how to do it. And then there was this talk about, well, we've got to do it soon because the kids aren't getting any younger. And me and Scott were like, that's a feature, not a bug. We've always wanted to make a high school film and make a film about high school kids. We made our middle school horror film. Let's make our high school horror film, let them both age into the roles, and then see how they develop as actors. Well, we got super lucky. As you can see, all the kids are phenomenal. They're just so great. And so it just all kind of came together despite me not really wanting to do it from the get-go and not taking it seriously. And so finally when we did, we found this whole piece, and we hope you guys liked it.
Obviously this was based on a short story, so you got one film. What are the challenges of basically having a very specific piece of writing that you have to expand on? I know a lot of horror literature has kind of done that. If you think Lovecraft and things like that, where you have to kind of expand on ideas. But also, to some extent, once you started writing and you and Scott working on, how much was Joe involved? Did you tell him what you were going with, or did he just leave you guys to just do it?
The two-part question. The first part of the question is adapting is it's hit or miss. With that particular story, the hard part was finding what the first act was, because the short story, for those of you that haven't read it, literally starts with Finn getting grabbed and thrown in the back of the van, and then he's in the basement. Like, that's just where the story starts, is he's in the basement. And there's only one ghost, not several. But from that point on, it was a very literal adaptation. And so there was a lot of stuff we had to build out in the second and third act, but we had to completely from whole cloth create a first act. And in the story, our protagonist doesn't really have too much definition of who he is. And that's why when Scott first brought me the story back in 2011, I was like, this is really cool, but it requires so much work, and we've got all these other ideas we want to play around with, so I don't see why we should pay to option somebody else's story when we have to do so much work on that, and we've got these other cool ideas. Well, it came around to a point where Scott was talking about wanting to make a film about his childhood, and he had been going to therapy and realized that a lot of the stuff that happened to him was not normal, was not okay, and he wanted to make some kind of film about that. And as we were talking, Black Phone came up and we said, what if we transpose those things that we want to write about onto our protagonist in that first act, and now we have a first act for a movie, and then we play through. And I called up Joe, who's been a friend of mine for a while. Me and Joe Hill share an editor at Harper Voyager. And so we've been put on the road before to promote our books together, and we became good friends. And so I just called him up and I'm like, what's the deal on Black Phone? And he was like, oh, actually the rights lapsed and they're just sitting there, you want it? And I said, yeah. He goes, I'll give you the friend rate. And so, and which was a very low amount, very low amount up front, and then he gets, we take care of him if the movie gets made, which is exactly what we did, and he got taken care of on this movie as well. In terms of this film, from that point, we were like, hey, do you want to write an outline? He goes, I am too busy. I'm writing this novel right now, King of Sorrow is the biggest thing I've ever written, and I just don't have time. And I was like, okay, well, we'll write it. So we went and wrote it based on his small pitch. And then he was the first person we sent it to and got notes from. So his were the first notes that got integrated into the script. And then once we had, and they were very few notes. And then from there, we sent it to Universal and Blumhouse, and it was, rip roaring go. Everybody was like, let's hit the gas, let's make this happen.
Now, when you're writing with Scott, like, what's the process, right? Do you have your own individual ideas, or do you guys just kind of game plan, you tackle it together, and just, like, how do you, like, when you collaborate, how do you, like, work through stuff?
It's different every time. It depends on what's going on in our lives at the moment. For example, with this film in particular, he was working on post for The Gorge. So this was one of those where he sat down and wrote an outline, and then I did a bunch of pages, and he would, on the weekends when he's done with the post, go and rewrite the pages that I wrote over the course of the week, and write a few new pages, and send it back to me, and then I would write over the course of the week. When he's not editing, often it's a day-to-day thing. So I'll be working several hours a day, he'll be working several hours a day. I tend to be a late-night guy. So he'll get up in the morning and write based on, working on my pages, and then writing some new pages, and he'll send them to me, and then I'll work on them at night and pass them on to him, and then we're like, 24 hours a day kind of writing when we're doing that. And we like to get on the phone or Zoom, or sometimes I'll just hop on a plane and fly out here and we'll sit in his backyard and smoke cigars for 3 days and just kick around ideas and just talk about, what if we did this, and what if we did that, and I always wanted to see in a movie, and we knock that around, and once we have the core kind of ideas, we kind of agree on which direction we're going, and then we just kind of run with it as we write the script and find new things, because you're always discovering as you're writing. So there's always, things that you didn't talk about that it's like, it would be super badass, what if I did this? And then, you send it off, and then Scott's like, oh my God, that's great. And then he writes something really crazy that you hadn't talked about that's like, oh fuck yeah, that is definitely going in the movie. And so it's just it's very much back and forth, and the timing of it and how much pre-work we do just depends on where we are. Like sometimes we won't have anything. Like once we're done promoting this, we're done finally for the first time in like 2.5 years, where we don't have a job that we have to walk into the next day. And so we've got a couple scripts that we're writing that we're just doing multiple scripts at the same time and working on a bunch of different projects together, and getting a chance just to catch our breath and write. But then, you know, invariably we'll get something triggered, and then Scott will go off into pre-production, and then we'll find a new schedule of how it works.
Now, not only is this like a ghost story, it's also like, you know, you got the psychic and dream-like stuff. It's also a winter horror, which is a very specific kind of horror. What were some of your influences, or like, because I feel like there's a couple nods to some specific things in there. Do you want to talk about those?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of nods to a lot of weird stuff in there.
Can I just start here? Was there not a curtains in there?
100%. And in fact, this is the thing, and it's one of those things because people have come up to me and they're like, "You had to put curtains in the movie," and I keep going, "That was Scott." This is one of the odd things that this was one of those movies Scott introduced me to, because he put that in the script, and I was like, "What is curtains?" And he's like, "Oh my God, I've seen a movie you haven't." And he was like, "You have to watch it." So I sat down and watched it that night. I was like, "Okay, this is badass. And yes, we need to have this reference." And as he talked about, curtains was one of those moments. It really ties into something that happened in Black Phone. For those of you that remember Black Phone, we have a moment where Finn is up eating ice cream, watching movies, watching The Tingler. And that was a scene from Scott's childhood where he stayed up, he had no idea what he was watching, he was just watching whatever the Late Late Show was showing, and it was The Tingler. And it was that scene where the red blood comes out and it just scared the piss out of him as a kid. And so he just had that, and curtains was another thing where he was flipping channels one time in the early 80s and came across the ice skating scene, and he's like, "The fuck is this?" And he had to find out what movie it was, and went out and read it and fell in love with it. And so that was that pull. But yeah, some of the other influences, of course, you know, pretty much any winter horror you've seen, for me very much, I'm blanking on the title right now, because, you know, of course, we can't get away from talking about The Shining, you know, anytime you're dealing with axes and snow, come on. But there's I'm gonna ask someone to help me here just because I'm having a stupid brain fart moment, but the Christopher Walken,
Dead Zone.
The Dead Zone scene with the kid on the ice always was something that stuck with me since I was a kid. And so that was very much when we were writing the ice lake scene, that imagery was in my head the whole time. And it just, but the real thing was Scott kept, a couple people have said it here tonight to me on the way in, but Scott said it when I asked him, "Why the fuck are we going to Canada to freeze our balls off for 3 months?" And he just looked me in the eyes and said, "Blood and snow, man, blood and snow." And so that was our mantra.
Now, when the film's in production, are you on set with Scott? Do you guys ever like,
Always.
is there moments where you're like, "Hey, we need to punch something up," or we might need to change stuff, or like how's that when you're in the production and you're doing rewrites or doing little things to just add to it?
Yeah, again, every process is different. Like when we worked on Doctor Strange, Marvel is always rewriting. They always have writers on set that are, you know, they don't feel the movie's done until they blocked it. In fact, that's something that Kevin talked about recently. He's like, "Oh yeah, we're always writing. We never go in with a script." And it's like, okay, that's not what you mean. They always go in with a completed script. The producers assume it's not done yet, and keep asking for changes and add new ideas. But like whenever Scott and I start from the beginning a project and we're not adapting someone else, we typically don't do rewrites on the day. We do rewrites in pre-production, because as we're trying to put it together, now we have to make it make sense in front of the camera. And so it's like, oh, that won't work, we'll have to do this, we'll do that, we'll do changes like that. But I'm always around to bounce ideas off when things go, you know, sometimes things go sideways in ways you don't anticipate. My favorite story that I share comes from Sinister, where one day I came in and all the costumers come up and they're like, "Oh God, thank God you're here. We have to fix something." I'm like, "What?" It's like, "Well, Ethan's fallen in love with his sweater." I'm like, "Well, yeah, we've all fallen in love with the sweater." And those that see Sinister know how rad that sweater is. Who doesn't love a good cardigan? I'm just saying. So, needless to say, what had happened was he's about to go into the attic and have a horror scene where he will fall through the floor, and he cuts his arm, and that means he's going to cut his cardigan, and we've already shot scenes afterwards in which he's wearing the cardigan, so we have to remove the cardigan somehow. So how do we take the cardigan off him? Because the script never had that. That was just something he found in the costume trailer that just really worked for the character. And so I spent half a day trying to figure out how to get Ethan Hawke to take off the sweater. And you have 2 shots to get him to take off the sweater, make it make sense. And so they come to me at lunch and they're like, "Have you figured it out?" I said, "Yeah, I cracked that hours ago." And they're like, "What?" "He cuts his leg. Nobody's gonna question if he has more than one pair of jeans." And then we're like, "Oh!" And so and that's what I did for half a day. So that's how I got paid. But yeah, so you know, sometimes it's just things like that. Like you have to solve a problem that didn't make sense until production elements got layered on that weren't in the script, and you'll have to reconfigure. And those are typically the things that I have to do on filming me and Scott. But it's very rare that we sit down and actually rewrite whole scenes. And then of course, you know, you're around during post-production, and if you need to reshoot a scene or reconfigure a shot, that's where you end up doing stuff like that.
Now you mentioned Ethan. We should talk about this cast because not only like did you reunite both like all the key players from the first film and got them to come back, but you kind of expanded all those characters. Like, was there any worry that no one was going to come back and you have to like, oh fuck, we have to rewrite and figure out someone new kind of thing, or did you know everyone was going to be on board?
Oh, we reached out to everyone beforehand to get everyone committed before we did. We had to know we had the kids, we had to have Ethan. You know, there were a few actors we knew we could write around if we had to, but didn't want to, like Jeremy Davies, who plays the father. And then Scott came up with this idea. He just loved. There were some really interesting videos online, in particular surrounding the kids. In particular, one Miguel. Miguel became very popular with teenage girls to the point that there was a girl who was ill and she had a Make-A-Wish, and her Make-A-Wish was she wanted to meet him. And so they set up an event to go surprise her at the mall, and you know, she was at her favorite mall, and Miguel shows up to hang out with her. Well, it got out on Instagram that he was there, and within an hour, the place was filled, a sea of teenage girls who were all desperate to meet him. And literally, they had to rush him out Beatles style. And Scott was like, "This video's nuts." And it's like, and he talked, while we were making the film, he's like, "This kid's gonna be a star, he's really an incredible actor." And he called me up and he goes, "I have a dumb idea." And again, I said, "I love dumb ideas." He goes, "What if we got him to play his own brother? You know, we'll change his look, he won't look anything like Robin, but we'll get him to play his younger brother, who's now older than his brother ever got to be." And I was like, "Oh, that would actually be cool, and we know the kid can act, so that would be great." And that allows us to do some stuff involving Robin and that closure as well. And so I was like, "Yeah, let's do that." And so, yeah, and everybody was on board. Everybody had a blast making the film the first time. We all really enjoyed it. It was one of those sets where everybody really got along. Everybody had a great time. Ethan, it was his first time ever playing a villain, so he really had a blast doing it. And I was like, "Yeah, I want to come back and do that again." And yeah, so we didn't have any problems getting him back. And once everybody was on board, we're like, "All right, we're writing the script. Let's make this movie." And there we go.
Now, because the Grabbers now become kind of a newer horror icon, which is very hard in this day and age because it seems like it's hard for lightning to strike. Can you talk about just like the Grabber from the first film to the second film and just evolving that as like, you know, our villain?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first film is very, you know, it's very John Wayne Gacy, and that was the inspiration that Joe Hill had come up with. And in fact, in the original script, he was in clown makeup. And Joe had called us up and said, hey, look, I hate to do this, guys. I only have one note to the script, but you know, when I wrote this short story, it was 20 years after It. You know, they'd already made it as a TV movie. No one was thinking about It and clowns anymore. And then, you know, when they remade It, it became a huge hit. And I don't want to be compared to my dad on this. Can we change the clown thing? And we were like, yeah, we can, but to what? And he goes, you know, I've always loved this notion of the old school 30s and 40s magician act, where he would dress as the devil halfway through the act, and he would perform tricks as the devil for half, and then as a magician for half. And often they had these really cool, weird, creepy masks. And Scott looked him up, and he's like, "Oh fuck, this is what we're doing." And he showed me, I was like, "Oh man, that's fucking right on." So he took it out to a couple of people, and the fucking legend, Tom Savini, was the one who was doing that. And he just sketched it on a cocktail napkin for Scott. Scott went, "That's the fucking mask." And so he and Jason Baker worked together and designed all of our masks for us and made the system to make it work. And then we saw the movie out as you do. And as a writer, your job is to leave it all out on the field. You do not leave extra threads out there for the audience to go, "Oh, I see where they're gonna make a sequel." You're not supposed to do that. In fact, I think a lot of what people are talking about today with superhero fatigue isn't so much superhero fatigue as it is getting fatigued to go into a movie only to stick around halfway through the credits to see the commercial for the next movie. And we absolutely didn't want to do that. And so the first movie was the first movie. So when we had to, attack this, now it's like, well, what were the rules we set up in the first movie for the spirits? And we've got to stick to those rules. We have to play by them. Now, we had some really wacky stuff in the first movie that allowed us to play around with temporality and things like that. For those of you that recall the pinball dance dream, where we have a conversation where we've got Finney talking to Pinball Vance in the basement while Gwen is having a dream, hearing the same conversation, but we find out that he's answering two different conversations at the same time. We just think it's one conversation. And we were like, well, once we can do that, we can play around with that here. And so we got to play around with, the surreal nature of dream time that way. But so in, developing them, he's like, well, what we know from the first movie is you start losing yourself and you forget a lot of who you were. And the afterlife seems to strip a lot of that away. And we played around with this idea of the good place and the bad place. And the good place strips away all the bad stuff and just leaves the goodness and the memories and that stuff. And the bad place, as he talks about in the film, strips away all the good stuff. And all that's left is your sin and your hatred and your anger. So he's a spirit of pure rage. And so everything he's going to talk about and everything he's going to do is all pertaining to his experience of hatred, anger, and sin. And so now we have this character that just exists as that. And he's so angry, not only because he was killed, but because he still blames Finn for his own choice to kill his brother. And so once we had that, we were like, well, of course it only makes sense that if this spirit wants revenge, he wants to kill Finn's sister. Like, he wants Finn to feel the same thing before he kills Finn, and that he has to suffer. And so once we had that template for him, we were able to kind of go through and write through. And one of the big things about all our characters is, this being a series about the afterlife, we wanted to have everybody's own personal beliefs kind of reflected in how they explain things. So of course, somebody who spent a lot of time working at a church camp would describe the afterlife as hell and would see things that way. We have this young woman who grew up, trying to understand her psychic powers and is understanding it through her Christianity that she got from her mother and from, as we show in the first movie, from the television show she's watching, and is kind of literally piecing it together because she has no real guide through it and is trying to understand it, whereas Finn is an agnostic like his father and he just deals with it as pure psychic phenomena and can't explain it and doesn't try to and tries to, ignore it when it's coming around later in his life. And so as we're developing the grabber, we're taking that lens and trying to create a villain through his own crimes and how he views his own crimes. And that was a really interesting experiment in creating the character. And so it was like rebuilding a character from the ground up on material that we didn't necessarily present in the first film that Scott and I knew, because we always overwrite and have more information so that we know everything makes sense. But then we whittle it down to the point that it entertains you in the theater and you feel satisfied and you don't feel like we over-explained everything to you. And so we had a lot of that to play with, but that's pretty much how we built up the grabber. And then Ethan was all on board to go in and go hard. And so he was fucking game. And it was so much fun to be on set with him doing that.
Excellent. We're out of time right now, but I'm going to give it up to you in this film tonight. Give it up to Rob. And one last thing, you got Blackstone 1, 2, you got Cargill. Any way you get Blackstone 3 the college years?
If Joe Hill calls me up with a good enough idea.
Excellent. Thank you.